Good morning, everyone. And today we are having the third lecture of the Frankenstein series. So, today we shall be going into an understanding of the monster itself. Now, I have been using for my lectures several books which I am consulting on a daily basis, and therefore there is nothing so very special about these lectures. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you an understanding of the text, but you can always read up. So we must understand the first thing that up till now we have spoken about the monster and how it was conceived. Now, regarding this, let me talk about Mary Shelley's childbirth. And she had a very horrible experience with her own childbirth, and that had a lasting impact on her mind. And she wrote about it in her journal, but that is some personal detail which I do not wish to go into, and I wish to directly go into the text itself because otherwise we will not be able to finish it in the due time. Now, at the center of the basic story of Frankenstein is the story of the monster, the horrid thing that Mary Shelley saw in her dream, and the filthy mess that moved and talked as she has spoken about it. Now, this frightening image of a decaying creature of horror conjures up for us of the horror in the text itself. But at the same time, it is the first of a new species, that is, a robot, or more specifically, an android which is programmed to think for itself. And it chooses to destroy all of the people whom its creator outwardly loves. Now, it is articulate, intelligent, and sensitive, and it argues eloquently for its own rights of existence, all the while murdering innocent people to punish the guilty and generally frightening the people around it. So, there we have a central aporia. I do not like the word paradox, and I use the word aporia in a very Derridian sense of it. Now, if Victor Frankenstein created a frenzied new alchemy that makes him the first of the many mad scientists, and the experience and the existence of the monster itself presents him with the first and the most enduring symbol of modern technology. Now, it also asks, what do we do with our own creations, especially when they fail to live up to the expectations of the creator? Now, the monster is, on the most deep and personal level, a projection of Mary Shelley's feelings of isolation and of hatred. But on a larger scale, it serves the same function as well. That is, the monster itself is an orphan of science, an unwanted child which was created and then abandoned, and it threatens to vent out its anger and its rejection on the very species that created it, that is, the species of man. Now, many readers, since its publication in 1818, have had to face the arguments laid out by the monster, and also the question of its survival have been problematic. Now, if we look at it from the Cartesian perspective, that is, from the perspective of Descartes, Descartes in his meditations says, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I exist. and the monster thinks. What does it think about? It thinks about its own ontological position. That is, why does it exist? For whom does it exist? And from whom does it exist? Now, with such thought, with such cognitive behavior, and such ontological questions concerning existence, we tend to question whether the monster is in the first place a monster at all, or whether it is something else. That is, the monster traverses the territory, it transcends, it transgresses into the territory of the human. Now, in an early review of his wife's novel, T.B. Shelley gave a brilliant argument. He suggested that there is in effect no later commentators on this subject. He takes the creature at its own word. That is, he asserts that the crimes it committed are not the offspring of any unaccountable propensity to evil, but flow irresistibly from the certain cause from certain causes fully adequate to their production. They are the children and adults of necessity and human nature. In this, the direct moral of the book consists: treat a person wicked, and he will become wicked. Now, look, something very interesting happens over here in Shelley's commentary. That is, Shelley, for the first time, personifies the monster. I have been referring it to as it. I am not personifying the monster, but Shelley is. He calls the monster a person. Now, if the monster is fully human, then mankind's treatment of it is criminal. And given this present age, Human Rights Commission would have been chastising all of us for treating it in the way that it has been treated with. But as a self projection, as a doppelganger which threatens to eradicate the existence of the original, or as an infernal living machine, it's clear that the monster has the supernatural or superhuman power of destructiveness, and the monster therefore transcends into the territory of myth rather than reality. Now, we cannot but deny, via Mary Shelley's descriptions for the face value, that the monster itself is abominable, it is grotesque, like the Minotaur, the dragon, or Gorgon, and it grotesquely combines the characteristics of more than one animal. That is, it is an amalgamation of several living beings. It has gained its own life, but it has not gained the significance that we have traditionally associated with life itself. That is, its life is purposeless at this moment. And only Victor Frankenstein can give it a purpose. Now, therefore, it is like Mary Shelley's The Monster in Search of an Author, quite like Luigi Pirandello's Six Characters in Search of an Author, where the monster is searching for a purpose from its own author, from its own creator. But this monster is even more horrible. It is half human, half machine, and it falls somehow in between life and death. And rather, it bypasses our very understandings of organic life and organic death. We know that all life, whoever is born must die, or whatever is born must die. Say there is a sapling today, it will grow into a tree, and maybe it will die in, say, 1,000 years. Say the long living trees. So that is the natural organic process. So death is also a natural organic process. But the monster transcends the limitations of this organicity of life and death itself. and therefore it is a thing which is unnatural, and it is met consequently by every human being as loathsome and instinctively overwhelming. Even Walton, at the end of the long story told by Frankenstein, that is Victor Frankenstein, knowing what he will see, confronts the monster and he confesses that I dared not again raise my eyes to his face. There was something so scaring and unearthly in his ugliness. Now, this unearthliness, I'm not talking about the ugliness. It is this the unearthliness which makes the human acceptance of the monster out of a question. And it is this unearthliness that kind of gives us a hint as to whether the monster remains unnameable. I am not calling it nameless, however, I am calling it unnameable. Now, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 19 and 20, Adam's dominion over plants and animals is demonstrated by his power to give them names, to assign them certain names. However, knowing the name of something has traditionally been associated with a certain magical control over it. How? If I know your name, I can call you by your name. That is, it forms a link between us, right? Or say I know the species of trees, I know the names of the trees, and I am lost on an island and I can identify the trees by themselves and I know which are poisonous, the fruits of which are edible, and so on and so forth. So it gives me a magical control over those things, as well as it gives that thing a specific location in the universal order, because we always like a cosmos, an ordered universe, and we always try to avoid chaos. Now, Frankenstein's creation as simply the monster aptly communicates its total otherness and therefore man's impotence to understand, to name, to locate, and to channelize the discourse of the monster. For instance, in 1970s, Michel Foucault, in one of his lectures, The Order of Discourse, said something very interesting. He said that in every society, certain discourses, what is a discourse? To oversimplify, a discourse is something said in a context. Whenever I contextualize whatever I say, that is a discourse. That is, now I am giving a lecture on Frankenstein, and whatever I'll say will be in response to Frankenstein, and there is a discourse on Frankenstein. So that's the simple way of looking at it. Now, when Foucault talks about discourse, he says that in every society there are certain discourses which are generated. Why are they generated? To order, give shape, channelize the entire power flow, the power dynamics of the society itself. However, there is always a fail safe as well. That is, if the discourse should fail, there must be something within that discourse, within that very discourse itself, which tries to take care of the entire thing. Now, let me give you an example. Say we are now going through the COVID pandemic. All right. Now, there is a discourse of vaccination. Okay. Now, whenever we are going for the vaccine, we are given the discourse that the vaccine can function as a barrier against the disease itself, right? That is why we are taking the vaccine. But there is a fail safe. There is a vaccine will not cure COVID. Rather, the vaccine will ensure that even if after taking the vaccine you get exposed to the virus, then also you won't succumb to it as much as you would have done otherwise. That is, your chances of dying out of COVID will be less. So that is the fail safe that is there. And now what happens is that when Frankenstein creates the monster, there is no fail safe to it. What was the failsafe was the hope that the monster would listen to Frankenstein. But Victor did not ensure anything. Victor did not ensure a training program, a scheduling program, etc., for the monster to listen to him. It is simple that the monster, Victor assumed that the monster would listen to him. But uh, when you'll grow up and you'll read more and more theories, you will realize that we must always challenge our preconceptions, our pre-received notions before embarking onto something. That is, first we must be on a very clear ground based on our notions, and only then and there we actually hope to have a proper implementation of our theories. Now, the physical characteristics of the monster are inherited from a whole family of humanoid monsters that roam free over the world in traditional folklore, in myths, in the stories. Now, as a girl growing up in England and Scotland, Mary Godwin, who was not Mary Shelley yet, no doubt heard some of the versions of the series of legends of the monstrous offspring of Cain, of whom Grendel is the most familiar. If you have heard about Beowulf, you know who Grendel is. Now, she also probably heard about the Middle European folktale of the golem, which I was talking about uh, in the previous class, in the previous lecture. Now, while on her travels, she may have even met a wild man as part of Swiss or Bavarian carnival or mummers play. Now, this fur-covered creature, half man, half animal, was supposed to inhabit the forests and glaciers of much of Europe. As old as the Gilgamesh epic and the book of Genesis itself, especially chapter 16, verse 12. The story of the wild man is found in such ancient texts as well as in the medieval paintings, in medieval arts, legends, and even in literature. So, an outcast like this monster in question was basically not something new. That is, a monster reaching out from darkness and attacking you was not absolutely new to Mary Shelley or to the way of or to the entire history of Western thought. Now, in the traditional ritual, which still survive in some form, someone dressed as the wild man appears and causes a mock terror among villagers, and to drive out, capture, or mockingly kill uh, that monster is still a ritual in some parts of Europe. Now, a similar episode occurs in Frankenstein and has become an obligatory scene in the films concerning Frankenstein. But more important over here are two concerns. One is Frankenstein's genetic heritage, the other is Frankenstein's moral ancestry. These two things are very, very important. Now, for this, we must look at the subtitle. given by Mary Shelley, which is the modern Prometheus. Now, the Prometheus myth was a very close parallel to the myths pertaining to Satan, the fallen angel. And for Blake and Shelley, Milton's Satan was an admirable rebel, a Prometheus who had taken the wrong path for the right action. And both Blake were of the opinion that Milton was all of the devil's party without knowing it himself. Now, for Mary Shelley, basically the monster was a double of Lucifer, the archangel turned arch destroyer, and his story is Paradise Lost, written in 1667, is like Frankenstein, and it is designed to define man's place, man's location in the universe, and give forms and shapes to the forces which threaten to displace man from his privileged position. If you look at the first line of Paradise Lost, it is of man's first disobedience and not of God's first creation, not of Satan's first rebellion, but it talks about first of man's first disobedience. And the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe with the loss of Eden, till one greater man, so look, man occurs twice, till one greater man restored us and regained the blissful sit. And then he says, sing heavenly muse. Now, when I was a student, I memorized the entire first book of Paradise Lost, but now I have forgotten most of the parts, and I can barely remember the first 26 lines. So I loved Paradise Lost. But in any case, let's come back over here. Now, Paradise Lost serves as a very beautiful parallel to Mary Shelley. Now, Milton tells the apocalyptic myth, uh, the apocalyptic Christian myth. I call it apocalyptic because of the loss of Eden, but it also is an apocryphal Christian myth of the fall. Now, the fall is not just of the mankind, but also of the rebel angels and how it affects human history as we know of it today. Now, Lucifer, who was one of the most beautiful of the archangels, was jealous of Christ's place in the divine family, and he revolted against his father with his legion of followers and was cast out from heaven into hell, transformed into a hideous being who was called Satan, and his followers became a crew of devils. Now, in the infernal pandemonium, they discuss how best to carry out the fight against God and finally resolve that they will become impeccable foes and implacable foes to the creed of humanity. And we have seen several instances of Satan traveling on the earth, tempting Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. And there is a long and bloody history of mankind which now the poem also ends with a beautiful promise, you see. That is, there is a distant promise of the redemption of Adam's descendants through the sacrifice of God's own son. Now, although Shelley's God was not his God, but they shared a feeling for a divinely created natural order. And direct evidence of a reading Paradise Lost in both 1815 and 1816 is everywhere in the text of Frankenstein, from the epigraph to the monster's last speech. Now, while her references to the poem may be contradictory in a few places, in general they are not haphazard borrowings. And Mary Shelley found in Paradise Lost a pattern, a specific pattern, which could give form to her own fears, her own apprehensions, and also a mythic shape to her understanding of contemporary technology, which, if gone wrong, would be detrimental for the future. Now, while planning uh, his experiment, Victor felt like Lucifer, and he says, I trod heaven in my thoughts, now exulting in my powers, now burning with the idea of their effects. So, like Lucifer before the fall, Frankenstein before the monster, that is the monster's creation, is in rebellion against his own creator, jealous of his own place in his own family, experimenting with a technological notion of the heavenly thunderbolt and planning to invert the natural order of things. Now, the interplay of Frankenstein and the monster is something like the binary relationship between Lucifer and Satan, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, each monster is, in outward appearance at least, a reflection of the inner self of its own creator. Now, both are separate entities, and both are different selves conceived at the moment of rebellion against their own creators and when given form with the hope that they will be a triumphant act, but they actually turn out to be disasters. And thus, the most beautiful of archangels becomes his own monster, cast into hell with only his memories and his evil intact. Now, similarly, right at the moment when the monster comes to life, Frankenstein remembers his limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, shriveled complexion, and straight black lips. The beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Now, the transformation of a beautiful dream to a loathsome reality, that is a nightmare in action, begins Frankenstein's long fall to isolation and to his death later. At the end of his life, he realizes the epic proportion, the epic dimension of his own crime and its punishment. And he says, like the archangel who aspired to omnipotence, I am chained in an eternal hell. Now, at first, Frankenstein tries to escape his own chains, and he runs from the monster in terror and in horror for a long time. And for some time, he believes that he is free from the vista of the monster, from the gaze of the monster. But on the icy slopes of the Chamonix Glacier, he meets it again and he hears its story. The monster tells Frankenstein about its slow transformation from a would be Adam to a fallen angel, and then to a modern Satan as a painful self awakening. Now, it begins its independent life without history. It is part child, part man, part machine. It has just been born, so therefore it is a child. If you think of it in the natural way, then it is a child. But it is a child which is neglected. Every child has a set of parents. Here, there is none. Now, I'm talking about a set of parents because back in Mary Shelley's time, there was no artificial birth. But this monster does not have a history. This monster does not have a childhood. This monster does not belong. And it is this unmovable condition of the negative markers. You see, we mark ourselves in our geospatial and our socio-temporal milieu by our history, our ancestry, our belonging to a society, our belonging to a family, our belonging to institutions, our belonging to several forms of social uh, encounters. But the monster does not have anything like that. It is just thrown into the world and thrown altogether, thrown out altogether. And therefore, the monster does not have a history, does not have a consciousness of who its actual parents are and why did they actually leave it. The monster is not an organic creation. That is, a human being grows from an embryo, then there is a gradual growth. But here the process is reversed. Several parts of several beings are taken together and then they are stitched up, and then there is lightning and thunder, and that's how the monster came back to life. Now, only with time will it learn that all of man's world is a garden from which it is excluded. Now, it will also learn that in nature itself, the monster does not have a place. It cannot locate itself. And that its only universe is quite like Milton's universe of death, the hell that has always been around it. The monster is therefore a hellish creature without a location, without a name, without a proper existence, without a proper history, without a proper understanding of where it came from, who it is, for whom it is, and what it is doing, what is its purpose. It is located in a void and it is trying to find out its own way in that void itself. Now, its first days in a forest near Ingolstadt resemble a kind of man's first days in the world, that is, in a state of nature, in a state of belonging to nature. And Jean Jacques Rousseau, in his writings, kept on arguing in this same line. He said that civilization was a very detrimental influence, a very corrupting influence to man, because man belongs in his natural state, and in his natural state man is an animal, less strong than some and less agile than others, but upon the whole the most advantageously organized of any. And he says, I see him satisfying his hunger under an oak and his thirst at the first brook. I see him laying himself down to sleep at the foot of the same tree that afforded him his meal, and there all his wants completely supplied. So, this very vision of the past assumed that all men were at peace, and it presumed that man was amply supplied with food, with shelter, and was able to learn speech by imitating animal sounds. Now, if Rousseau was looking at this monster, then he would have seen the monster beginning his own life exactly this way, living on acorns, nuts, and berries, drinking from a brook, and sleeping under a tree. Unfortunately, none of the same tactics that work for man, according to Rousseau, works for the monster. It fails to find enough food or adequate shelter. When it tries to imitate the bird's song, the horrid grunts that emerge from it frighten all the birds into silence. And its inability, the monster's inability to live in what was thought to be the most natural state of being for man, points up to its own unnaturalness. The world of nature is hostile for the monster who does not fit into it. The landscape the monster finds himself in is more like the wasteland that Satan and his legions of fallen angels find themselves in after they awaken from their stupor of their own fall into damnation. Remember the description of hell in Book 1, lines 50 to 83. On all sides round a horrid veil, where fire was burning, and there was a liquid fire, fiery lake, and there was a solid fiery ground, and so on and so forth. Now, the burning lake of Paradise Lost lies in a frozen continent, dark and wild, beat with perpetual storms, where the fallen angels are punished by being made to feel fierce extremes by change more fears, from beds of raging fire to starving eyes. Hopeless, lost, and confused, the beaten army viewed first their lamentable lot and found no rest. Through many a dark and dreary vale they passed, and many a region dolors, over many a frozen, many a fiery Alp, rocks, caves, lakes, fanes, bogs, and shades of death. Now, this is Milton saying. And look at the traditional places where the monsters have inhabited. And there, Milton says, nature breeds perverse, all monstrous, all prodigious things, abominable, unutterable, and worse than fables, yet have feigned or fear conceived. So clearly, Rousseau's state of nature for the monster is a Miltonic infernal space of torment rather than a space of Wordsworthian recluse. Now, its first sensations are of a very painful alteration of light and dark. It remembers feeling pain invade me from all sides. Now, extremes of cold and heat continue to oppress the monster. Half frozen, it discovers a fire and innocently puts its hands into the embers. Now, we know what the results would be. Now, throughout its unnatural existence, the monster remains in an icy universe of death beyond the boundaries of the living world, a place that Milton describes as fit for the monsters. Yet, it is always also associated with fire and lightning. Now, you see here, I cannot but make a comment on another uh, philosopher whose name is Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza, in his book Ethics, Spinoza made a very interesting observation. Spinoza says over there that every single element has a duality of nature. For instance, I'm feeling cold. If I put my hand in the fire, that is, my hands are cold, and I put my hand in the fire, I'll burn. Similarly, say I am thirsty. I take a glass of water and I drink it, my thirst is quenched. But imagine I'm thirsty, I jump into a river and I don't know how to swim. I'll drown and die. So every element has this duality of nature. Now, nature itself also has this duality in itself, because in nature you can find Rousseau's nature, Wordsworth's nature. On the other hand, you can find Milton's nature and Coleridge's nature, also Tennyson's nature. Nature read in tooth and claw. So you see, here we have a very interesting sets of commentary on the natural man, the man of nature, nature itself, and the monster not belonging anywhere. Now, with this, I'll conclude this lecture and continue from here in the next one. And hopefully, we'll have 4 or 5 more lectures, and that ought to give you some idea of Frankenstein. I'm not very clear, but some idea of Frankenstein. And that's the best that I can do. So, thank you so much for listening to me today, and hope to see you very soon. Thank you. Have a good day.